Welcome to Three Thoughts On. I'm here with Melissa King. Melissa, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Raphael?
Doing well. Thank you so much for making time. This is definitely a topic that is of great interest to me, and I think it's will be for will be of great interest for a lot of people. Today we're going to talk about autism. So before we get started, could you give the audience a little bit of who you are and your background and how you got involved in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started kind of in the field like everyone starts in the field by accident. So I started when I was in undergrad. I was getting kicked off my parents' insurance and I needed a job with insurance. So I had a friend that said, "Hey, come work at the school district, work with kids with autism as a paraprofessional." So I started there in St. Louis and worked with kids, and I actually started to get in trouble for taking the kids outside and wanting to run their programming and work with these kids on the playground because I didn't want to sit, one on one and at a table with them for 8 hours straight. They were getting bored, I was getting bored, and my supervisor would come in and say, "No, you need to sit here with them and run these sessions." And so I kept thinking, like, I know there's more to this. I know there's a science behind this. I need to learn more. So went on and got my master's in behavior analysis, and then continued to want to learn more about the science and moved to Omaha, Nebraska, and went and got my PhD.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Let me,
Yeah.
before we get into some of the thoughts that you and I had discussed before, did you see, as you went through your background there, you obviously went from a very academic environment, right? Where you're going for master's
Mhm.
degrees, you're going for a PhD, and then eventually you move out into what some people may call the real world, right? Where you're actually
Yeah.
dealing a bit more closely with the children and with their families. Was there anything that changed in your approach as you went from an academic to a more day to day with the children and families?
Yeah, I think my approach has changed as I've gotten older. I think in the academic setting, very research focused, right? So you look at kind of one intervention, and I'm looking at the change in behavior with just that one intervention. And then when you go out into, like you said, the real world, then you see it's, wow, there's a lot of other factors that I need to take in consideration. Also, there's other providers that I need to be working with and making sure we're all on the same page to make sure we're coordinating care. And sometimes, and even in the academic setting, right? Depending on where you're at, if you're doing research or you're in the clinical world, um, you're always taking all of those things into consideration, right? Research is a little different because you're looking at one intervention, looking at their behavior. When you're in that clinical setting, you're looking at all of those pieces. Um, and sometimes maybe families, I have to also consider what the families are going through, right? And maybe my recommendations are, I want you to do this, and I know based off the science and the research that this is what our best outcomes are going to be if we do X, Y, and Z. But sometimes that might not be feasible for a family. So I have to take a step back and say, okay, let's work together. How can we make this work? How can I adjust my recommendations such that this is going to be beneficial for everyone? And maybe we don't work on everything all at once. Maybe we take a step back and we say, okay, number one, this is what we're going to work on. Then we'll work on something else a little bit later. I will also say, excuse me, as a parent, my approach has changed. So when I was a young clinician, um, I always tell people I would smack myself for the recommendations that I provided to parents when I was not a parent. And then now being a parent, I come back and I say, wow, you're tired. And I know why you didn't collect data because you're tired. And there's a lot of other variables going on. There's other siblings, sometimes with autism as well. You're trying to manage your relationship with your spouse. I mean, all of those things, and sometimes it's just not a hill you want to die on. So, running trials, when I say go home and run 5 trials, that might be really hard for a family to do every day. and collect data and all of those things. So I think I'm just more cognizant of some of my recommendations, and then also why families may not follow through with some of my recommendations, because I get it. So I work with them on what are ways that we can be most successful together.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that that is the one thing that it's the autism topic is new for me. I It's something that I've engaged as of recent, the past couple of years, is because of a common friend that works in that field now. But I see the disparity between how people approach it when they observe the child, as assuming it's a child, it could be a young adult, right?
Mm.
Versus the family, and the surroundings and all that entitles, right? All that covers or encompasses is probably a better word. And people forget that the families are a big part of the solution, but the families, it's a difficult thing for them as it is for the child to try to do the day-to-day things that specialists like you are trying to tell them so that there can be a plan that can be taken forward. So I'm glad, definitely glad that you brought that up. Want to get into a couple of things here. So um, what are the top three things that you, in your experience over the years you've been doing this, that people ask you about autism, or maybe the top three misconceptions? I'll let you go in whichever direction you want to go. Because I think even though we know more today, I still feel like we don't know nearly enough. And I can see that because of the questions that people ask. So, in your view, from your experience, your own personal living in this world, what would be the top three things that either people ask you about autism or that you feel are misconceptions? And we can actually do both if we have time.
Yeah. So I would say I can name three and then we can kind of dive into them. I would say I get asked a lot, does my child have autism? I mean, even my sister-in-law was asking me about my nephew, does my child have autism? And I think there's just so much out there right now on autism. There's a nice spotlight shining on it, which is great for access to care. But I think there's a lot of confusion about autism. I think the other thing I get as a practitioner is, will my child talk or speak? I get that question quite a bit, especially being in the early intervention space. They're really young when they come in, and parents want to know, will my child ever say mommy? Will my child ever say daddy? So we get that question quite often. And then another one, which I'm glad families are asking, is how do you know what's the best treatment? How do you know how to find kind of the right provider when you're looking for services? Because you do a quick Google search and everything under the sun comes up. So I think it's really quite challenging, to know as a parent. First, you're just trying to understand, does my child have autism? And if they do have this diagnosis, what do I do now? What are next steps? So, kind of going back, you had mentioned before, but there's a poem. It's called "Welcome to Holland" that resonated with me when I read this, and I worked with a family, and they kind of spoke to kind of the point of the poem, but it really speaks to, you think you're packing for this trip and you're going to one place, and you get there and the pilot says welcome to Holland. And it kind of makes me think, for like parents, right? You have this vision when you're a parent that, oh, this is my child and we're going to do all of these things, right? They're going to do X, Y, and Z. They're going to get married and they're going to have these successful careers, and all of these things are going to happen. And then you as a parent receive that diagnosis of autism for your child, right? You see your child, and so a lot of times parents are like, something's not right, right? And I think with that, it's kind of like the poem where you're like, oh, you're in Holland. I didn't pack for Holland, right? I wasn't ready for for what I just, I received this diagnosis of autism. Okay, now all the feelings come with that, right? A little bit of anger, sadness. What do I do? Confusion, right? You have all these feelings. And then it's like, okay, we're in Holland. What are we going to do now? And now you're action oriented. And so that poem really resonates when I think about, being a parent and probably what families are going through when they receive that diagnosis, because they're just not, there's just a lot going on when you receive that diagnosis, a lot of emotions and feelings with that. So I wanted to bring up that poem just because it does resonate with me so much of, especially when I'm working with families, like I think about that and okay, does my child have autism? Okay, let's work through all of this. How can we work together, and what are some ways I can support?